go over for price elasticity of supply. The first is the perfectly inelastic. So this is if the supply curve is a vertical line. So I'll draw it out here. So we have a vertical supply curve. So no matter what price is, the supply is going to be completely unresponsive to it. So no price change can affect the supply. The reason being that for some reason for this industry, there is no way to increase the supply in the short run. So an example is DC Defenders game. They played in a stadium with, let's say, 30,000 seats. There's no way for them to expand that and to sell more tickets. You want to say it was bigger, smaller? But there's no way for them to adjust the size of the stadium in the short run. The other example is if the supply curve is a horizontal line. So we'll say that's perfectly elastic.
Thank you for bonus points. Hey, welcome to class. That's 4. Keep going.
I've been keeping track too, but I'm glad you guys are keeping track for me just in case. Nice to have that double check. So if the supply curve is horizontal, we say it's perfectly elastic. So if there's any price change, the supply is going to be infinitely responsive. So if there's an increase in price, the supply is going to increase to infinity in theory, or if it decreases, it'll decrease to 0. Doesn't really make a lot of sense abstractly. So think of this example. In the long run, the production of agricultural goods, so whatever crops you want to talk about, are perfectly elastic. So if the prices rise above the cost of production, so farmers are going to make a profit, they'll grow as much as is demanded. So they'll increase the supply to whatever they can in the long run. And if the price drops below the cost of production, so they're losing money, they'll drop their production to 0 instead of losing money. They'll just break even. So if there's any price change, we see huge changes in the long run in the amount of crops being supplied. And that's pretty much like the only decent example of perfectly elastic supply. Okay, so here we have a brief summary of the price elasticity of supply. So here we have elastic, so if there's an 11% increase in price, we end up with an 18% increase in the quantity supplied. So the quantity of the good is very responsive to change in price. It's more responsive. With an increase in price, we see a greater increase in the quantity supplied. For inelastic, we see the opposite. So if there's an 11% increase in price, we see here, it causes a 5% increase in the quantity supplied. Again, so it's less responsive than price. When you have a special case of unit elastic where the price elasticity of supply is equal exactly 1. So if there's an 11% increase in price, we get an 11% increase in the quantity supplied. And it's very rare because it's not good. Very often it's not going to hit that exact 1. Then we have perfectly elastic, which is the horizontal supply curve. And then the perfectly inelastic, which is the vertical supply curve. So if you're a firm, if you know the price elasticity of supply, it can help you predict the effect that changing demand is going to have, which would be very important if you're trying to plan how much to produce, trying to know if you're going to make a profit or a loss if you increase or decrease the units you sell. So when demand increases, we know that the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity are both going to increase. But if the supply is inelastic, the quantity supply can't change that much in response to the demand change. And because it's not very responsive to price, it's not going to change very much. The price is going to end up rising a lot. But on the other hand, if the supply is elastic, you see the opposite. It's very responsive to change in price, so they're able to accommodate that change. And the price is going to rise a lot less. So the next two slides will show an example of each. And you can see the difference between whether the supply of a good is elastic or inelastic, and what that means for a firm. So right here, demand typical is the typical demand for parking spaces at a summer resort for a weekend. Normally a certain amount of people go, but July 4th we see an increase in demand. More people like to go on vacation 4th of July, celebrate the long weekend and everything. So we see the demand curve for just that week, just to the right, an increase in the demand curve. So this supply curve for the prices, this example is inelastic. There's not a lot of additional parking spots they can open up. So when the demand curve shifts to the right, there's not a large increase in the quantity supply because there's not much they can do in this case. Because the supply is inelastic, it doesn't change that much, you end up with a huge increase in prices. And this increase in price, what its function is to help people ration the parking spaces. So maybe they take Uber, maybe people carpool. It's a way to conserve these resources.
Welcome to class, Dave. See you, Dave.
I'm gonna have to put a limit for the next exam.
It's not fine, so.
Let's see. Yeah, so it's difficult to expand the supply of parking spots here because we don't see a large change. We end up in the quantity supply, we end up with a large change in the price. So now, in this opposite case, there is a very elastic supply curve. Let's say for the same example, the parking lot, like you can't really expand that, but there's a couple big fields right next to the parking lots, so you can have people park their cars in the grass there. So in this case, supply is going to be very elastic. There's a lot of additional spaces they can start using. So when the demand curve shifts out to the right, we end up with a large increase in the quantity supply. A lot more people are going to be parking in those new fields they have, they typically don't use. So the price is only going to increase slightly. So we know, or we can estimate whether the price elasticity of supply is elastic or inelastic. We can anticipate what it's going to do to prices and to quantity. Even if it's just a very rough estimation, we could say that the supply is elastic. We're going to have a large increase in the quantity supplied and a smaller increase in the price. Whereas if it's inelastic, the supply is not going to change very much, then we end up with a large increase in price and a small increase in the quantity supplied. Now, usually when we do supply and demand curves, we do just like a generic one. You get the curves at like a 45-degree angle, like the demand curve there that I drew. In most cases, if we're just talking about like what's the effect of a shift in the supply curve on the price and the quantity demanded, all you need to do is like a 45-degree angle like that. You can keep it simple. It still tells you what's going to happen to the supply or to the price and the quantity if there's a shift in one of the curves. But if we're looking for, if I'm asking for, I talk about elasticity. If I say like, I don't know, the supply curve for this is elastic, and then ask you to shift the supply and demand curve, then I'm going to want you to draw it more realistic. But just for generic stuff, the curve like that works, just to keep it simple. Okay, so there's a few things in the back of the PowerPoint slides to help you guys study. That brings us to the end of the price elasticity of supply and demand. You guys have any questions about what we covered so far? If not, we can jump into the review. All right. So the exam is going to be 30 questions. You'll have 25 multiple choice questions and then 5 short answers and problems. One of them is going to be a problem using the midpoint formula. But you will have the formula on the question on the exam. So you just have to like plug the numbers in and go.
That's cool.
42 extra credit questions. You'll have, the class is 50 minutes, so you'll have 50 minutes plus, if you need extra time, probably about 5. We'll have to wipe down all the desks after class, so and there's another class that comes in here afterwards. So it can't take too long. We will have at least a little bit additional time if you need it. You can use a calculator for the elasticity problem, because you end up with like decimal points. It's easy, but you can't use like a graphing calculator that you can like write stuff in. It's be like a more simple calculator, a financial calculator.
The first time I've heard of that one.
Oh, when I was in high school, we used to like, you could like write out like sentences in there and stuff.
You just type in the stuff. You go back and just like, use it crap. Spend so much money on that thing.
You don't need it, you're just gonna divide.
It's true.
Does any other question about the format of the exam? I think I covered everything I need. If not, if you think of something the rest of the class, just ask me. All right, do you guys have any questions from the study guide?
We go over the problem.
Yeah. Of course, it's on 2 pages. Okay, so you're a small gas station. Oh, well, I can pull it up on here. All right, so you operate a small shell gas station across the street from a Sheetz. So you're selling at $2.50 a gallon. So you're at point A, right here, on the demand curve. You're selling 2,000 gallons of gas a day. And you're thinking, maybe I should drop the price to $2.30. Sell the gas for less, so you can attract more buyers. So they leave Sheetz and come over to you. So using information we have on this graph, let's calculate the price elasticity of demand and see what we think the response is going to be. So our formula is Q2 minus Q1 over Q1 plus Q2 over 2. Divide that whole thing by P2 minus P1 over P1 plus P2 divided by 2. So that's going to equal Q2 as well. 2,500 minus 2,000 divided by 2,000 plus 2,500 divided by 2. And divide that by Q2 is 230 minus 250 divided by 250 plus 230 divided by 2. Once you have all the numbers plugged in, from there it's just easy subtraction, and division. I'm making sure you get all these right. Important before you start to double check that. So then we'll start doing the math here. So that's what, 500 divided by 2250. Divide that by negative 20 cents. Divided by what, 240. Can't do all that in my head. 500 divided by 2250. I got 0.2 repeating. Someone else get that?
Yeah.
Okay. And then 0.2 divided by 240. Got 0.08. Okay. 0.083.
Negative.
Good call. Divide that 0.222 divided by 0.0833. Negative 2.665 and some other stuff.
How do you have to round up? How far do you have to round up?
Like 2 or 3 decimal places. Like don't just say like, don't round it up to 3. You can give me a couple that's all that matters. Remember, it's you take the absolute value of that. So we end up with 2.665.
I got 2.67.
Did you round along the way, or did I round too much along the way?
I think you're right.
Okay.
You said you want the absolute value?
Yeah. So we end up with the positive number.
All right.
Yeah. If you I was rounding these off to like 3 digits.
Yeah, I
to
did
do the
too.
math. So if you like kept them in your calculator and did like the real things.
No, I did it the way you did it.
Oh. You said you got what?
Yeah, 2.675.
Yeah, I tossed an extra 3 on this one.
Okay.
That's why. And for things like that, remember to show your work. If you end up with like a slightly different answer, but it's obviously due to rounding, but because you rounded here, you didn't round, or I did. So that way I know what you did and can give you all the points for it. So, price elasticity of demand for this gas station is 2.675. Is that elastic or inelastic? Elastic. So a change in the price is going to lead to a larger change in the quantity demanded. People are more responsive to change in price. So, does this sound reasonable
Yeah.
for this example?
No.
No, why not?
Isn't gas more inelastic?
Gas itself is more inelastic. What about for stations themselves competing against each other?
Yeah, I guess that's more serious.
So you're more willing to go to a new gas station if the price is a little bit lower.
Mhm.
So since the price is inelastic, is this good for the firm to cut their price? Or is it bad for the firm to cut their price?
Good.
Who said that?
You said it was elastic or inelastic?
I said it was elastic. What's going to happen in the revenue if the demand for the good is, or the price elasticity of demand for the good is elastic. Remember, that's going to increase their revenue. Sorry. So because people are responsive to change in price, when they lower their price, they're going to get a lot more consumers. The number of people buying from them is going to outweigh the money they're losing from the lower price. So if you're looking at like the picture of it, this area right here is the revenue they're making originally. This area right here is the revenue they're making now with the lower price. So you can just kind of eyeball it. If the demand curve is like drawn to scale, and in this case, I will draw the demand curve to scale.
Would you solve all that question?
What's that?
You solve all that question, so it's all the calculations.
What do you mean?
I mean, you can tell just by, yes, no, right?
You can tell if it's elastic or not, but you can't tell.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you can't estimate the answer. Well, I don't think. Maybe you can. If someone guessed that number, I'd be impressed as hell.
Actually, yeah. Yes, it.
All right. And if demand was inelastic, in this case, and the firm, this gas station lowered their price, they wouldn't get a lot, they wouldn't sell a lot more. So they would not make up. The increase in the quantity demanded would not make up for the lower price. So they ended up losing money if the demand was inelastic. All right, you guys have any other questions that you wanted to go over? All right, can someone explain opportunity cost for me? Yeah, the value of the next most useful thing that you're giving up. So like the cost of a good isn't just like the money you lay out for it, it's what else you could have done with that money. So you're like alternate choices. That's because we face scarcity, there's only so many resources that we have to make these choices. So we have to give up stuff. We have to try to figure out what we want the most. All right, what's the difference between scarcity and poverty?
But scarcity is like the aspect of having the needs to meet like basic ones, but can't fulfill unlimited ones because you need a ration, whereas poverty is like just it's like the state of being poor, so like you don't have the resources at all, I'd say.
Yeah, and poverty is like an arbitrary line. As a society, we say like you need this much to be considered to like be living a good life. But as the society gets richer, that line moves farther and farther up. So there's a sort of poverty is more like determined by society what they consider a decent standard of living, whereas scarcity is just the fact that we have more wants than we have the resources to fill them. So we can get rid of poverty. We can eradicate poverty as long as we don't like change that line, but we can't get rid of scarcity, or at least we haven't figured out how to do it yet. All right. Someone explain the assumption of rationality in economics and then why it's important.
Say if you're like saving limited resources and who gets to use them, deciding who gets to use them based upon like proof and stuff.
That's part of it. That's say how we use rationality, and that's because of rationality that's possible. And the rationality, as for economists, like how we use it, is that people act in their own like self-interest. They act what they think is the best for them. So if you're given two options, you're going to choose the one that meets your needs better. You're not going to go out there and choose something that you know doesn't fit your needs. We weigh cost and benefits. So you might not pick the highest quality thing because the cost of that might be too high for you. But once you weigh both the cost and the benefits, you'll choose what's best for you, what best meets your needs. And without the assumption of rationality, without people doing what is best for them, we really can't do any economic analysis. If people behave randomly, if they just do weird things for no reason, then if you increase the cost of something relative to its benefits, you don't know how people are going to react. Whereas if we assume they're rational, you increase the cost relative to the benefits, people are going to do less of that. So it makes analysis harder. It makes all sorts of government policy and regulation more difficult because you don't know how people are going to act if there's no rationality. It doesn't mean that people, like how we typically use it, that people have zero emotions, that they're like robots and just like calculate everything. And it doesn't mean that people can't be wrong. You can think something's like the best for you at the time, and then 20 minutes later realize that you were wrong. You can do that and still be rational. It doesn't mean that you're infallible. It just means that in that moment you're doing what you think is going to be best for you. Because we use it, tend to use it different within like economics and the real world, it's easy to slip up on like questions on rationality. Other one, how about subjective value versus the labor theory value?
Subjective value is the price that somebody puts on something. So a sentimental value, it might go up. Or if I need it more than what people buy clothes with. Labor theory value is how much it actually costs to produce.
Yeah. Yeah, so every person has different wants, different needs, different tastes and preferences. So we all value something, like a good or service, differently. And then answer the opportunity cost question too. That's how opportunity cost comes into this. Every person, because they value things differently, when they go to buy something, two people could go to buy the same thing, but the second place thing, they're like opportunity costs, could be giving up something totally different. So because of that, these costs are more subjective. They're like the value is in people's heads. The labor theory value is the older theory, which said that basically the value of a good was what it cost to produce it. So any price above that was considered, wrong price gouging because that's not what it cost them to make it. But that ignores the fact that people have place different values on these goods. So there's several things that everyone buys that they'll pay way more than the cost of production for. But it doesn't matter because to that person, to all of us, like the amount of money we're spending on that is still less than how we value it. Okay, what's the role of entrepreneurs in a market economy? All right, you guys want to go over that question? I was trying to hit ones that people normally trip up on exams. We can do all of them if you want. All right, how about positive and normative economics? What's the difference between those two? Or positive and normative analysis in general? Yeah.
Positive, it's like when X value is affected Y. And normative analysis, like the example that you gave us, it was like there's a higher inflation rate good for U.S. consumers, but can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So for normative analysis, normative economics, you're discussing it, whether what happens is good or bad, or whether like it should happen.
Yeah.
So you're discussing like what ought to be, what's the best case scenario, whether something is good or bad,
Yeah.
versus positive is just what's going on.
Okay.
So like for the example I gave, like for positive analysis, you would say like an increase in money supply leads to an increase in the inflation rate. Then for normative analysis, is this increase in the inflation rate good? I mean, you can think of that for any time someone talks about different government policies. Like, since most of my research is occupational licensing focused, say the effect of occupational licensing on average it increases wages by about 15% for professionals. Normative analysis of that question would say, okay, is this good or is it bad? If you have this higher cost, is it worth it because we're getting other benefits? So for normative analysis, you can give your own opinion. There's an argument you're making, like backed up by whatever facts you have, where positive analysis is just explaining what's going on. We're going to try to focus, or we will focus more on positive analysis in this class, but there will be some times when we can do, like, answer questions with normative analysis. I just think it's worthwhile to understand the difference between the two. Okay. Now, how about entrepreneurs? What's their role in a market economy?
Find like the next big thing that's like only convenience for the people. Like just find opportunities where money can be made really.
Yeah, I like that next big thing that you used. Yeah, they find needs that aren't being met in the economy, and they figure out ways to supply those needs. And of course, because of the market economy, they'll end up profiting from it. So they get rewarded for helping make people's lives better, for finding this need and meeting this need. It can be anything from like new consumer products that we never had before. It can be improving existing products. It can be making new ways to produce goods that are more efficient, so now it costs less. A lot of different ways you can be an entrepreneur. You can provide value. Now, what's the function of profit and loss in a market? This is kind of similar to the role of entrepreneurs. I talked a little bit about it in my end today.
I guess, companies like losing money, but it's like a chance when they're not doing well, not doing money. So.
Yeah, these both work as an incentive. So loss, those firms have a hard budget constraint. They can't lose money for very long. If they're losing money, that's a wake-up call that they're doing something wrong and they need to change soon. So they know the goods or services they're providing aren't providing value to consumers, or not enough value to consumers to warrant using those resources to make those goods. And then profit helps encourage firms to recognize what's selling, what's meeting consumer needs, and to produce more of it. So if you're the firm you're an entrepreneur, you come up with this new product, and it's really meeting consumer needs, you're doing a really good job, so you're making a ton of money, it's a signal to you and an incentive to you to keep making those goods, keep making more and more of them for people. And then for other firms, it's a signal for them that, hey, this is good, an incentive for them to start selling in that market. So first company that invented smartphones, like they're making a ton of money on it. So they know, hey, people really like this, I'm gonna make more and more and more. And then other companies that have that sort of capability now say, hey, this is a product people love, so then they start making them. So it moves the market in the direction of what consumers want, of what they think is meeting their needs. So you have the loss side that filters out the bad products that are a waste of time. and shifts those resources from the crappy products now to better products that are actually making money. And then the profit encourages firms to produce more of the goods that fulfill people's needs, and other firms to get involved in making those goods. So it has both. We talked about price, how it's a signal and incentive. Profit and loss are also a signal and an incentive. So at the same time, while you're encouraging someone to change what they're doing, you're also showing them what's working and what's not working. All right, how about the law of demand?
As price increases, the quantity demanded decreases, and when price decreases, the quantity demanded decreases.
That's right. So you end up with a downward sloping demand curve. How about the Allen effect? Someone explain what's going on here? I always find this interesting because pretty much everything with like supply and demand is very intuitive. But the Allen effect I thought was counterintuitive when I first learned about it. The example was cigarettes, because they did this back in the 60s. They had high quality cigarettes and low quality cigarettes. And California put a $1 tax on all packs of cigarettes, no matter what the price was. So you'd expect, like, okay, the expensive cigarettes, high quality cigarettes, are now relatively they're more expensive. They're a higher absolute price. So people are going to shift to buying the cheaper ones. When in fact the opposite happened, and people bought more of the expensive cigarettes. The reason being that now the opportunity cost of the expensive cigarettes is lower. You're giving up fewer low quality cigarettes. Let me pull up or write up for you guys. So before you had low quality cigarettes and a high quality. Before tax and after tax. Before tax it was $1 for a cheap pack, and it was $3 for like a high quality pack. Put a $1 tax on both of them, end up $2 and $4 a pack. But now the opportunity cost. So if you want to buy one high quality pack, you're giving up 3 low quality packs originally. Now after this tax, at $4 and $2, you're only giving up 2 low quality packs for one high quality pack. So remember opportunity cost. In this case, the opportunity cost of the high quality one, the expensive one, actually decreases. So more people end up buying the expensive cigarettes instead of buying the cheap cigarettes. That's a basic idea of the Allen effect. You look at opportunity costs when you're comparing two goods. All right, we got about 5 minutes left. So any questions that you guys, any other questions on this that you guys want me to go over? Or any other questions about the exam itself? Know that the substitution effect and the income effect, how they affect the demand for a good or service, they both go on at the same time. So you can't separate one or the other when you're estimating it. Like, you just know those two things are happening. And you guys good on drawing supply and demand curves and shifting them around?
Should be.
Understand what happens if there's going to be a, how the invisible hand works. So like when that shift happens, if the price stays the same, like how it's gonna be forced down, forced up. All right, then you guys can take off.